The argument that I'm making in this class and the people who've done the work in other work in new literacy studies is that the traditional view of literacy as the ability to read and write rips literacy out of its sociocultural context and treats it as an asocial cognitive skill with little to do with human relationships. That traditional view of literacy cloaks literacy's connections to power, to social identity, and to ideologies, often in the service of privileging certain types of literacies and certain types of people. Nonetheless, great claims have been made for literacy in that traditional sense. In fact, as I will describe in this lecture, literacy has been argued to be the basis of what was referred to as the Great Divide between cultures, oral cultures versus literate cultures, between the primitive and the civilized. So at the cultural level, literacy is supposed to be the sine qua non of modern, sophisticated, complex cultures. At the individual level, it's supposed to lead to higher orders of intelligence. However, again, this argument that I'm making and the seminal theme of the class, that literacy has different effects in different social settings and none apart from that setting. So this large body of work that you've been reading about, new literacy studies, has begun to replace the traditional notions of literacy with a sociocultural approach. So I'm going to review some of these key developments that have led up to the sociocultural approach, so you can see that the new literacy studies has its origins in the collapse of the old oral literate contrast. And out of the deconstruction of that contrast come more contemporary approaches to literacy, not as a singular thing, but as a plural set of social practices or literacies. So I'm going to begin with the primitive and the civilized. Humans tend to think in dichotomies, and no dichotomy has played on the popular and the academic mind more insidiously than the contrast between the primitive, or the savage, and the civilized. And of course, that's all in quotes. That contrast has often been used, on the one hand, to trace an evolutionary process with modern man at its pinnacle, and on the other hand, to romanticize the primitive, as in Eden, from which civilization represents a fall. People sometimes travel to get to what they think are these primitive places on Earth, but neither extreme is warranted. And in anthropological research, at least old-fashioned anthropological research, primitive societies have been characterized with particular kinds of characteristics: small, homogeneous, non-literate, highly personal, held together by a strong sense of group solidarity. They were claimed to be regulated by face-to-face encounters rather than abstract rules. That these cultures were incapable of abstract thought. They were considered irrational, childlike, inferior to modern man. Or woman. On the other hand, and in contrast, modern urban societies, what we call civilization, were described and typified by being large. And being large, there were diverse groupings of people, widespread literacy and technology, and the sense of, and there was science and history. That cities were places where many social relations tend to be impersonal, and life was lived in sort of these grid of impersonal forces and rules. However, that primitive civilized dichotomy, with the advent of modern social anthropology, was broken down. Primitive societies, so-called primitive societies, were not primitive in their thinking, what they said, their language, what they did, in any evolutionary sense. And they were anthropologists like Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, who championed many of the practices of primitive societies. The great anthropologist, French anthropologist Levi Strauss showed that the classification of the natural world among South American Indian tribes was as complex and as interesting as that of the academic biologist. There are many other studies by many anthropologists who continue to demonstrate similar kinds of understandings. But this idea of primitive societies has tended to permeate even our modern thinking about societies over the course of time. One of the things that Levi Strauss tried to emphasize with his work on mythological thought was, and he did this without questioning really, was how cultures, he claimed, moved from the science of the concrete to the science of the abstract, and through which stages. So two influential pieces of work suggested that the answer was literacy. So we have two people, Eric Havelock's Preface to Plato, and Jack Goody, the anthropologist, The Domestication of the Savage Mind. So I'm going to talk about Havelock first. Havelock argued that Homeric Greek culture was an oral or non-literate culture. His characterization of that culture has been used both as a characterization of oral cultures generally and as a cornerstone in the argument that it's literacy that makes for the great divide between human cultures and their way of thinking. So here is his argument, that Greek oral epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey, in their original forms, were a storehouse of social directives. He called it an encyclopedia of conduct in the form of contrived and memorized speeches. The epic was the way the culture passed down its values and knowledge. Havelock argued that the epic took the form it did due to the demands of human memory in the absence of writing. It was recited with a heavy metrical rhythm and constructed out of a large set of pre-given memorized formula, like short phrases that would fit the meter, as well as a large set of pre-given motives, stereotypical characters, stereotypical actions and events, and then also wider themes that recurred throughout that epic. There was, he argued, a scope for creativity in how those building blocks were arranged and ordered on any occasion of recitation. Recitation was always sensitive to the reactions of the audience. So oral poetry constituted didactic entertainment. And if it ceased to entertain, it ceased to be effectively didactic. It was rhythm that underlay that pleasure, the rhythm of recurrent meter, formula, motifs, and themes. Further, since knowledge in an oral culture is compelled to be obedient, he argued, to the psychological requirements imposed by memory and the story form, it was couched in the contingent, dealing with actions and actors, not abstractions or principles. So Havelock argued that that kind of discourse, since it's the only form of speech in the culture that enjoys a certain autonomy and preservation, represented, and I'm going to quote from him, the limits within which the mind of the members of that culture can express itself, the degree of sophistication to which they can attain. So that Havelock argued, sort of along that same lines, in fact, as did Plato, that the teller of tales and his audience were under a spell. The epic poet was under the spell of the epic rhythm created by the meter and recurrent themes. The hearer, in fully identifying with the telling of the tale, also entered the spell. The epic was an acting out of an identification with the values and beliefs of the society. Innovation in values and ideas was difficult. The cost of giving up what one had memorized and memorizing anew was too great. Now Plato, one of the great writers of Greek civilization, sought to reorder Greek society, to relocate power. And to do that, he had to break the power of the epic poet, Homer, because his care resided the moral and intellectual heritage of the society. No surprise that in Plato's Perfect Society, described in the Republic, he excludes poets, Homer. So, going back then, Havelock writes, what woke the Greeks? Havelock's answer was alphabetic script literacy. A change technology of communication. Refreshment of memory through written signs, the alphabet, enabled a reader to dispense with most of that emotional identification by which alone the acoustic record was sure to recall. That could release psychic energy for a review and a rearrangement of what had been written down. And what had been written down could be seen as an object, a text, and not just heard and felt. In other words, you could take a second look. Now, a second influential person who argued for this great divide between oral and written was Jack Goody, who was an anthropologist. Goody moved in his book, The Domestication of the Savage Mind, moved beyond Greek culture to modern non-literate and semi-literate societies. He saw the development and spread of literacy as a crucial factor in explaining how modes of thought and cultural organization changed over time. Goody and his person he worked with, Ian Watt, laid out some of the outcomes that they saw as linked to the advent of writing, and in particular to the invention of the alphabetic system that made widespread literacy possible. They suggested that logic, in the restricted sense of an instrument of analytic procedures, seems to be the function of writers, or rather of writing, since it was the setting down of speech that enabled humans clearly to separate words, to manipulate their order, to develop syllogistic forms of reasoning, and to perceive contradictions. With writing, one could arrest the flow of speech and compare side-by-side utterances that had been made at different times and places. Essentially, Goody's procedure was to take certain of the characteristics that Levi-Strauss and others had regarded as marking the distinction between primitive and advanced cultures, and to suggest that many of the valid aspects of that distinction could be related to changes in the mode of communication, especially the introduction of various forms of writing. Goody related the development of writing to the growth of individualism, the growth of bureaucracy, and of more depersonalized and more abstract systems of government, as well as to the development of the abstract thought and syllogistic reasoning. Ultimately, he argued, it was that ability to deal with it, to have abstract thought and syllogistic reasoning that culminated in modern science. So that Goody saw the acquisition of writing as effectively transforming the nature of both individual cognitive processes and social processes. Now, the work of Havelock and Goody was ultimately generalized into a sweeping philosophical and linguistic and anthropological statement about orality and literacy as a great divide in human culture, thought, and history in a person whose name is Walter Ong's influential and very entertaining book, Orality and Literacy. So, Ong argued that oral and literate cultures had made us revise our understanding of human identity. Writing, commitment of word to space, enlarged the potentiality of language, as he would say, almost beyond measure, and that writing restructured thinking. Oral cultures, he said, produce powerful and beautiful verbal performance of high artistic and human worth, which are no longer even possible once writing had taken possession of the psyche. Still, without writing, Ong said, human consciousness couldn't achieve its fuller potentials, couldn't produce other beautiful and powerful creations. So in that sense, orality needed to produce and was destined to produce writing. Literacy, as he talked about, was absolutely necessary for the development not only of science, but it was necessary for history, philosophy, really clear understanding of forms of art, and indeed for the explanation of language, including oral speech itself. There's hardly an oral culture or predominantly oral culture left in the world today that was somehow aware of the vast complex powers forever inaccessible without literacy, he argued. That awareness for them was agony, rooted in this sort of primary oral culture. Um, he would argue that people want literacy passionately. But they also knew, he said, that moving into the exciting world of literacy means leaving behind much that was exciting and deeply loved in the early oral world. He said that, and I'm quoting him now, we have to die to continue living. Ong went on to offer a very strongly stated characterization of thought and expression in oral cultures. But in doing so, he made a crucial move in claiming that, and I'm going to quote him now, to varying degrees, many cultures and subcultures, even in a high technology ambience, preserve much of the mindset of primary orality. So, and really indeed, as we'll talk about, many of the features he cites have been claimed to be characteristic of, for example, lower socioeconomic African American cultures in the United States. We'll come back to that. Because lower socioeconomic African American people in the United States still have ties to a former rich culture, both from the days of slavery in the United States and from African cultures, and are at the same time less influenced in mainstream middle-class groups by what we'll talk about, essay text literacy and school systems that perpetuate it. But anyway, Ong went on to claim that many cultures which have known writing for centuries had not fully, what he said, interiorized it. And he used examples of Arabic culture and certain other Mediterranean cultures. He also pointed out that oral habits of thought and expression, including massive use of formulaic elements of a style similar to that of Homer, still mark prose style of almost every sort of Tudor England, some 2,000 years after Plato's campaign in writing against oral poets. So the range of application of Ong's contrast between literacy and orality is greatly expanded by his inclusion of groups which he refers to as residual orality on the oral side of the dichotomy. There have been, and even are to this day, discussions of differences between oral and written. Linguists today, oftentimes, for example, one of the famous linguists who studies writing, Wallace Chafe, for example, contrasts writing essays and that of continuous speech, suggesting that differences in the process of speaking and writing have led to specific differences in the product. Like writing is slower than speech, while reading is faster, and allows, which he argues has allowed written language to be less fragmented, more syntactically integrated than speech. Writers have time to mold their ideas into more complex, coherent, integrated whole. And in addition to this sort of integrated quality, Chafe called attention to the fact that written language fostered detachment from speech, which is face-to-face and usually more highly social than writing. So writing becomes integrated and detached, while speech is fragmented and much more involved. Of course, he is talking about essays. And as we will deal with increasingly in this class, the issue of context, what the person is doing with written language at the time, really becomes the crucial piece. Because while it may be true that writing essays is more integrated, does involve using more complicated lexical and syntactic devices in speech. written language in terms of essay writing may make heavy use of nominalizations, particles, certain adjectives, and subordinated clauses. But it's not the same if you do instant messaging or text messaging and other forms of writing. So context matters, but we will come to that. But this issue of literacy being this pivotal variable that changes how people think and changes culture, how it's characterized as that, is seminal in the way that we talk about what we want for our children, what we want for our students. In many ways, classroom teachers are very much like Ong in terms of the belief that children really, really want to develop literacy. And when they don't have literacy, as Ong talked about in terms of cultures, we talk about in terms of students, what children are missing. We will continue with these ideas in the next lecture.